Option 1. The epic and cinematic hook, best for a documentary-style intro. What defines a nation? Is it the borders on a map, the laws in a book, or the bloodlines of its kings? For the United States, the answer is something entirely different. America is not a place, it is an idea. It is a relentless experiment in self-government, a high-stakes gamble that ordinary people could govern themselves without a monarch. But the history of that idea is not a simple fairy tale. It is a gritty, complex, and often violent struggle between our highest ideals and our darkest failures. From the first footprints on a frozen continent to the digital frontiers of the 21st century, this is the story of how a ragtag band of rebels became a global superpower and how the American people have spent 250 years fighting to define what that freedom really means. The story of the American people is not merely a chronicle of dates and battles. It is a vast, sweeping narrative of human resilience, idealism, and the relentless pursuit of a more perfect union. It is a story that begins long before there was a named nation, in the frozen silence of the Bering land bridge and the bustling cities of the Mississippi Valley, and it stretches to the digital frontiers of the 21st century. To understand the history of America is to understand the history of the modern world, for the American experiment has, for better or for worse, shaped the destiny of the globe. In the beginning, the continent was a mosaic of complex civilizations. From the Iroquois Confederacy in the Northeast to the ancestral Puebloans in the Southwest, millions of people lived, traded, and warred across the vast landscapes of North America. They had their own histories, their own governments, and their own profound understanding of the land they inhabited. But in 1492, the collision of the Old World and the New World began. When Christopher Columbus arrived in the Caribbean, he set in motion a chain of events that would decimate the indigenous populations through disease and conquest, while simultaneously opening the door to a new era of global exchange. The European powers that rushed to claim this land, the Spanish, the French, and the British, brought with them their rivalries and their institutions. It was the British, however, who established the most enduring foothold along the Atlantic seaboard. Starting with Jamestown in 1607 and Plymouth Rock in 1620, these early settlements were fragile, often brutal endeavors. Yet, they planted the seeds of a unique culture. They were a mix of religious dissenters seeking freedom, indentured servants seeking opportunity, and adventurers seeking wealth. Over the next century, 13 distinct colonies emerged, each with its own character, but all bound by the English language, English common law, and a growing sense of self-reliance. As the colonies grew, so too did their desire for autonomy. The French and Indian War, which ended in 1763, left the British Empire with a massive debt, leading Parliament to attempt to tax the colonists without their consent. The rallying cry of no taxation without representation echoed through the streets of Boston and the halls of Philadelphia. Tensions escalated until they finally erupted into violence at Lexington and Concord in 1775. The American Revolution had begun. It was a war that the colonists were not expected to win. They were a ragtag militia facing the mightiest military machine on earth. But they possessed a weapon more powerful than gunpowder: ideas. In 1776, Thomas Jefferson penned the Declaration of Independence, articulating a radical new philosophy that all men are created equal and endowed with unalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. For 7 long years, under the leadership of George Washington, the Continental Army endured hardship after hardship. With the crucial assistance of the French, they finally defeated the British at Yorktown in 1781, securing their independence on the world stage. Winning the war was only the first step. Building a nation would prove far more difficult. The first attempt at government, the Articles of Confederation, was a failure that left the states weak and divided. Recognizing the need for a stronger central authority, the Founding Fathers gathered in Philadelphia in 1787 for the Constitutional Convention. Through months of intense debate and brilliant compromise, they drafted the United States Constitution, creating a system of checks and balances that would stand the test of time. This document established a federal republic, a government of laws rather than men, and it remains the oldest written national constitution still in use today. In 1789, George Washington was unanimously elected the first president, setting the precedents that would guide the office for generations to come. However, the birth of the republic was shadowed by a terrible contradiction. While the founding fathers spoke of liberty, the institution of slavery chained millions of African Americans to a life of forced labor. This original sin haunted the nation from its inception. As the country expanded westward, doubling its size with the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, the question of whether new territories would be free or slave threatened to tear the Union apart. For decades, politicians attempted to patch over the growing divide with compromises like the Missouri Compromise of 1820, but the wound was too deep. By the mid-19th century, the United States was undergoing a profound transformation. The Industrial Revolution took root in the North, turning cities like Boston and New York into manufacturing hubs, while the South remained agrarian, dependent on the king cotton economy. The election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860, a man opposed to the expansion of slavery, was the breaking point. 11 Southern states seceded from the Union, forming the Confederate States of America. The Civil War that followed, from 1861 to 1865, remains the bloodiest conflict in American history. It was a war of brother against brother, fought over the soul of the nation. At Gettysburg, Lincoln redefined the war as a struggle not just for Union, but for a new birth of freedom. When the war finally ended, the Union was preserved and slavery was abolished by the 13th Amendment. The Reconstruction era that followed attempted to rebuild the South and integrate freedmen into society. However, the promise of Reconstruction was short-lived. By the end of the 19th century, the rise of Jim Crow laws. While the South rebuilt, the rest of the nation looked outward. The late 19th century was the age of the robber barons, industrial titans like Vanderbilt, Carnegie, and Rockefeller who built vast fortunes in railroads, steel, and oil. They drove the American economy to unprecedented heights, but at a great social cost. Millions of immigrants arrived from Southern and Eastern Europe, pouring into Ellis Island and filling the factories of the industrial North. This wave of immigration changed the face of the American people, adding new layers of culture, language, and tradition to the national fabric. It was a time of rapid urbanization and labor strife, as workers fought for fair wages and safe conditions in the face of unchecked corporate power. As the 20th century dawned, America stepped onto the world stage as a global power. The Spanish-American War of 1898 announced the arrival of the United States as an imperial force, gaining territories like Puerto Rico and the Philippines. When World War I erupted in Europe in 1914, America initially stayed neutral, but eventually entered the war in 1917, providing the fresh troops and supplies that tipped the balance in favor of the Allies. President Woodrow Wilson hoped to make the world safe for democracy, but the peace that followed was fragile. The 1920s roared in with economic prosperity, flappers, jazz, and the explosion of automobile culture. It seemed like the party would never end. Then came 1929. The stock market crash triggered the Great Depression, the worst economic downturn in history. Thousands of banks failed, a quarter of the workforce was unemployed, and dust storms ravaged the Great Plains. In the midst of this despair, the American people elected Franklin D. Roosevelt. With his New Deal, FDR fundamentally changed the relationship between the federal government and the people, creating Social Security, ensuring bank deposits, and establishing public works projects to put the country back to work. Just as recovery began, the world was plunged into darkness again with the outbreak of World War II. For a time, America stood on the sidelines, but the bombing of Pearl Harbor in 1941 galvanized the nation like nothing before. The entire economy was converted to the war effort. Women entered the workforce in massive numbers as Rosie the Riveter, and American industry produced an arsenal of democracy that overwhelmed the Axis powers. On the beaches of Normandy and the islands of the Pacific, American soldiers fought with incredible courage. By 1945, the Axis powers were defeated. The United States emerged from the war as one of the two global superpowers, alongside the Soviet Union. The post-war era was a time of unprecedented growth and confidence. The GI Bill sent millions of veterans to college and fueled a housing boom that gave rise to the modern suburbs. The baby boom generation was born. However, this era was also defined by the Cold War, a tense standoff between the United States and the Soviet Union that threatened nuclear annihilation. This conflict played out in the space race, the arms race, and proxy wars in Korea and Vietnam. At home, fear of communism led to Red Scare, witch hunts, while the fear of nuclear fallout became a constant anxiety in daily life. Yet the mid-20th century also saw the rise of the civil rights movement. Inspired by the nonviolent protests of Mahatma Gandhi, leaders like Martin Luther King Jr., Rosa Parks, and John Lewis challenged the moral conscience of the nation. They demanded that America live up to the promises of its founding documents. Through sit-ins, freedom rides, and the March on Washington, they dismantled the legal framework of segregation. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 were monumental legislative achievements, marking a turning point in the long struggle for equality. This era of social upheaval also saw the rise of the women's rights movement, the environmental movement, and the anti-war protests against the conflict in Vietnam. The late 20th century witnessed the end of the Cold War. Under the leadership of Ronald Reagan, the United States engaged in an aggressive military and economic buildup that the Soviet system could not match. In 1989, the Berlin Wall fell, and 2 years later, the Soviet Union collapsed. The United States stood alone as the world's sole superpower. The 1990s were largely a time of peace and economic expansion, driven by the rise of the internet and the digital revolution. Globalization connected markets like never before, and American culture, its movies, music, and technology spread across the planet. However, the new millennium began with a shock. On September 11, 2001, terrorist attacks on New York and Washington, D.C. shattered the sense of invulnerability. In response, the United States launched the War on Terror, leading to prolonged military engagements in Afghanistan and Iraq. These wars, along with the 2008 financial crisis, tested the resilience of the American people once again. The political landscape became increasingly polarized, and the nation found itself grappling with deep divisions over the role of government, social issues, and its place in a rapidly changing world. Today, the history of the American people is still being written. The country is more diverse than at any other point in its history, a true mosaic of ethnicities, religions, and backgrounds. We are a nation struggling to reconcile its past with its future, debating the meanings of liberty and equality in a modern context. We face challenges of climate change, technological disruption, and political polarization that seem insurmountable. Yet, if history has taught us anything, it is that the spirit of the American people is one of adaptation and perseverance. From the indigenous peoples who first walked this land to the immigrants arriving today, the history of America is a story of ordinary people doing extraordinary things. It is a story of farmers and soldiers, inventors and activists, dreamers and doers. It is a story of failures and flaws, but also of a constant striving to build a more just and perfect union. As we look to the future, we carry the weight of this history behind us, understanding that the American experiment is not a finished product, but an ongoing process, a promise kept alive by the actions and the faith of the American people.